Okay, sorry for the technical difficulties. We're trying to live stream on two places at the same time. It's hasn't worked out as we were expecting.
I saw your channel has started streaming, so we should probably start over.
Oh, okay, fine. Okay, so let's just get started then, maybe. Sorry about this. Yeah, go on, Meghna.
All right, so on behalf of the Committee for the Friendship of the Indian Chinese People, I would like to welcome everyone to this event, Intercivilizational Dialogue for Democracy. And before we begin, I would like to ask everyone to mute themselves and also turn off their videos, except for the speakers. Okay, so I will begin the event by reading the mission statement, which can also be found on our website. In December 2021, several international leaders convened under a, quote, democracy summit initiated by the American government. At the summit, Joe Biden declared that defending democracy against authoritarianism was the, quote, defining challenge of our time. The summit came off as a desperate attempt to form a fragile alliance to isolate nations that refuse to operate within and offer an alternative to the Western world order in this time. Democracy, in its most superficial definition, was used as a rallying point for this project to bring together developing nations from the Third World alongside the developed West. This is an unnatural alliance that includes nations whose labor and natural wealth fuels the economies of the West, as well as those same neocolonial powers. The two sides share little in the way of economic interests, culture, positive historical ties, and indeed, even political systems. In the name of democracy, the West acts to undermine humanity's genuine and organic paths to democracy, sovereignty, and self-determination. Democracy is weaponized as a way to force Western values upon non-Western nations. Recent events in Afghanistan and Ukraine have shown that the US-led, quote, rules-based order has reached its breaking point. Nations are either reluctant or unwilling to follow norms set by international institutions that protect Western economic interests, such as NATO and the IMF, at the cost of their own security and national interests. Even as the US has tried to rally support to isolate and condemn Russia, nations outside of Europe have refused to follow American leadership blindly. The continuing use of illegal sanctions as a weapon by the West is only decoupling them from Russia and China, and hence accelerating de-dollarization of the world economy. While the West claims the moral and democratic high ground, and thus the right to unquestioned leadership, in reality, it functions to disunite nations and people and to form hostile and competing blocs. A new multipolar world, however, is emerging with Russia, China, India, Iran, among other nations at its core. The economic and political crisis within the West continues to intensify. The US remains polarized since the election of Donald Trump and faces high levels of unemployment, violence, and economic inflation. The institutions of liberal democracy face a crisis of legitimacy. Competing interests have been emerging within the European Union since Brexit, and the events in Ukraine have made evident the deep divisions in NATO and the Western Alliance. We are living through times which require a deep and substantive effort to understand and deepen an alternative and radical vision of democracy that can serve the masses of people of the world. We need a democracy that can allow states to end poverty and ensure participation from their citizens in the running of their institutions. The poor of the world are crying out for an end to the rule by Western, quote, experts and a return to people's democratic rule. It is a time to reassess the democratic project and explore ways to deepen people's control of their own destinies. Western imperialism has consistently attacked the project of widening democracy in Asia, whether it be Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, or the colonial plunder of Asia as a whole. It has furthermore asserted the superiority of Western civilization over all other civilizations and forms of political and social organization. True democracy must include the right of nations and civilizations to reject Western liberal democracy and determine the structures of their state on the basis of their own civilizational values and goals. The Indian freedom struggle and the Chinese Revolution constituted world historic steps in the forward movement of world democracy. They led to parallel but distinct attempts to establish a democratic state in light of the unique civilizational character of these two countries. In substance, these movements struggled for a democratic solution to imperialist exploitation and rejected narrow liberal democracy. As Gandhi said, for example, Western democracy is on trial, if it has not already proved a failure. May it be reserved to India to evolve the true science of democracy. Similarly, Mao had said, this new democratic republic will be different from the old European American form of capitalist republic under bourgeois dictatorship, which is the old democratic form and already out of date. The states that were set up after independence were civilization states, responsible to the whole people and attempting to take into account particular civilizational characteristics. The working out of the characteristics of these states is an ongoing process. These two struggles contributed to the unfolding of the world spirit of democracy. Their study and understanding becomes paramount as the world searches inevitably for a direction out of the political and economic crises that Western institutions face. These two revolutions against European imperialism were foundational for the great democratic struggles of the people of the world. We see them in parallel to the anti-colonial movements of Africa, other Asian nations, as well as people's struggles in Europe and the United States. In particular, the Black freedom and civil rights movement from within the American empire is inseparable from these strivings of humanity. Western civilization must no longer be permitted to dominate the world. In this intercivilizational dialogue for democracy, we will discuss and include the progressive contributions of European enlightenment and Western civilization, but reject any attempt to place them above other civilizations and downplay their contributions. We see this dialogue as a step in the renewal of the discussion of new forms of political, social, and economic organization more suited to the realities of our time. We hope to contribute to an international situation defined by peaceful coexistence, in which the right of all peoples and nations to decide their paths to and forms of democracy is respected. We believe that such a dialogue, unmediated by the West and unmediated by intellectuals that assert the superiority of Western civilization, could make a significant contribution to determining the path for humanity towards a new democracy and a just multipolar world. So with that, I would like to introduce both of the speakers. First, I would like to introduce Ambassador Bhadrakumar. MK Bhadrakumar has over 30 years of experience as a diplomat. He has served in numerous countries, including territories of the former Soviet Union, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, South Korea, Sri Lanka, and Germany. He was ambassador to Turkey and Uzbekistan. Ambassador Bhadrakumar is a commentator on Indian foreign policy and has written extensively on the decline of the West and the rise of the multipolar world. His writings have appeared in numerous national and daily publications, including The Hindu. His commentary on current events can be found at his website, indianpunchline.org. I would also like to introduce Dr. Zhang Weiwei. Dr. Weiwe is a professor of international relations. He is a director of the China Institute at Fudan University, a think tank dedicated to promoting academic and policy-oriented research on the rise of China. Professor Weiwe was an interpreter to both Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng. He has written numerous books exploring China's model of governance, including The China Horizon, Glory and Dream of a Civilizational State, and The China Wave, Rise of a Civilizational State. So before we begin, I would like to briefly explain the format. We will have each speaker speak for about 30 minutes, followed by time for question and answers. So to begin, I would like to invite Ambassador Bhadrakumar to speak.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. Familiar faces, unfamiliar faces, but most of all, I regard this as a privilege to be a co-panelist along with Professor Weiwe. I've read his writings, I share his views, and I find him a profound thinker. And more than anything else today, I look forward to listening to him. But I have been called to speak ahead of him, which is not fair because I have really very little to contribute the way that he can to the proceedings today. But I'll try my best. Thank you, organizers who have invited me for this event. I find many distinguished names, including especially from abroad. I find a face of a great writer on China on the screen here, Martin Jakes. I feel greatly honored that he has taken part. He is taking part in this event. Let me begin by saying that the events which are unfolding today have a lot of background. At the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the disintegration or the disbandment of the Soviet Union, I was a diplomat serving in Moscow at the time. And I recall at the beginning, let me mention this from my memory, a conversation with an American colleague in the embassy circuit. He asked me, how much time do you think you will give Russia to rise again? Russia hadn't, I mean, the disbandment hadn't taken place, but this was the question that he posed to me. I was quite taken aback because like a lot of us, I never imagined that the Soviet Union would collapse the way it did. And I still think that it was not inevitable. It stemmed from the poor equations between Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, largely, and then a torrential course of events which overtook everyone and upset all kinds of calculations that many had. But in India also, we never expected the collapse of the Soviet Union the way it did. But it's important to know that there were people who were looking beyond this and at a certain near conceivable future where the Russian power would resurrect. Of course, this is quite in sync with Russian history, where like a phoenix, it had risen from ashes many a time. And it was entirely conceivable that this was not going to be the end of Russian history. But, you know, what it showed is that there was a certain kind of mental framework even at that time existing as to how to cut down Russia, how to prepare for this eventuality of the resurgence of Russia on the global stage. Now, this is something we need to keep in mind because when we speak about the world order, here what is in play is actually a process which began with the Bolshevik Revolution, when, Western powers tried to stifle the revolution, they didn't want it to consolidate. And right from that time, there was this agenda. And like Madeleine Albright once said, why should one country have so much of excessive resources and such a large landmass? This is not fair. You see, this is a kind of perspective that was there that has been there on Russia for over a century. And even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this thought was very much there that this entity would be a permanent challenge unless it is cut down to size once and for all to American supremacy hegemony. Now, therefore, the crux of the matter is here, more than anything else, there are several templates at work here today in this situation, in this crisis in Ukraine. But the most important thing is this, that Russia's existence, Russia's resurgence as a global power. Russia is certainly not the only power of that stature in the on the global arena today. China is very much there, but it is Russia which can destroy the United States, which has a thermonuclear capability to destroy the United States. And for a significant period of time ahead, this would be a stark reality. And therefore, Russia is a different case altogether from the American point of view. Secondly, the resources, we are now seeing it is right now playing out in front of us that, a country with such a resource base, phenomenally endowed, in mineral resources and so on, it cannot be tackled easily, because it has a kind of autonomy by its birthright, what nature has bestowed on it. So this is the other uniqueness of the Russian challenge for the US. So what is coming up now that the number one threat for the United States is Russia? This has always been there in the last 30 years or so, even after the disbandment of the Soviet Union. So this is one template, that we have to keep in mind, because the Ukraine crisis is very complicated for this reason, that we outsiders look at it from a geopolitical perspective. But for Russia, this is an existential struggle. And I have written more than once this, that, that there are all kinds of discussions take place about winners and losers in this war, or this conflict in Ukraine. But the point on which I have absolutely no doubt is this, that Russia cannot afford to lose in Ukraine. So this is very important to bear in mind. Russia cannot afford to lose, because this is an existential struggle for Russia. Putin himself has said that we are with our back against the wall. There is really no space to retreat. That is the stark reality. So this is not an esoteric, this is not a geopolitical struggle, and we will be minimizing the gravity of the situation today if you look at it in terms of de-dollarization or such phenomena, which are also on parallel tracks becoming visible today. Particularly, the next 100 days are going to be extremely dangerous because the Western narrative about the Ukraine war doesn't hold together any longer. Even in the Western media, even in the American media, even in the New York Times, there is a grudging acknowledgement that the Russian operation is on course, and it's far from a situation that Russia can be defeated. In fact, more and more candidly, Western journalists are writing that Ukraine cannot win this war. This is not really about Ukraine. This is really not about Ukraine. The United States, for its structuring its narrative, pitted Russia against Ukraine, pitted democracy against authoritarianism and so on. But this is really speaking is not that way. The quintessentially, this is what I have explained in the beginning, and my conviction is that quintessentially this is that struggle which is manifesting there. And now in the coming period, now that the Americans realize that putting down the Russians, defeating them is not going to be possible, they are trying to extend it, and they're trying to weaken Russia to the extent possible. And that way derive advantages out of it. And also, if and when negotiations take place, which I don't foresee to be in a near future, in a conceivable future, but if and when these negotiations take place, Russia must be compelled to negotiate from a position of weakness. Now, this is the only agenda that is there in their mind. But they are now introducing weaponry into Ukraine, which are going to be, I don't know how many of you watch Russian television. It was absolutely devastating to see the rocket attacks with a kind of latest weaponry which has just reached the Ukrainians from the Americans. The fierce attack in the space of 1 minute, I think some 60 hits or something like that on Donetsk city. Now, there is no conflict going on there. It's a peaceful city. And the targets were not military targets at all. They're just housing estates. And it's just a fierce attack like this. And if this happens, there is going to be a Russian retaliation. And now a second aspect is that they are giving weaponry to Russia, to Ukraine, which can hit Russia. And Biden is claiming that and Blinken, they are claiming that the Ukrainians have given an assurance that they will not be used against Russian territory. But there is a whole history available to us in this respect about Ukrainians finally acting on their own, in their interests. You know, there are wheels within wheels in this situation. So you see, this is a matter of time, I fear, that they might use these weapons because there is a certain revenge mentality as far as the Ukrainian nationalist forces are concerned, which goes back to Second World War and even beyond that, you know. And it's very deeply embedded, that kind of hostility towards everything Russian culture, Russian literature, Russian music, everything. So you see, they will use that. And then what happens is this retaliation may take a different form. Lavrov, Medvedev, they both have said in the last 2-3 days, making it very clear that they may hit Western targets. Now, if that happens, NATO enters, Article 5 comes into play. So, you know, we are on a very dangerous situation today. And therefore, when we look at, the point I'm making is when we look at the post-conflict situation or the impact of this on the world order, we tend to overlook that this is a very dangerous situation today, and there are many variables at work here. And everything depends actually on how the interplay of these variables, how it develops in the coming months. People are already speculating that it may go on even into next year, even beyond, and so on. You know, it's very significant. Russians do not call this a war. They call it a special operation. They have said repeatedly that there is no timeline. They have objectives, but they have no timeline. So you see, it can take very different forms. And yesterday, day before yesterday, day before yesterday, I think TASS reported that there is an armada of these vessels which are used for landing troops. The very significant capability. Russians have assembled their vessels from the North Fleet and Black Sea Fleet, and all together a dozen of these amphibious capability. I don't know what they call it in military terms, but for landing troops on the coast. Now, the only coast that is available there is Odessa. The rest is already under Russian control. Sea of Azov is completely under Russian control. Crimea is under Russian control. So it's only the Odessa region, that particular slice, that is held by the Ukrainians and by their Western advisors. There's very substantial presence of Western advisors there in Odessa. So when these amphibious vessels are being prepared, that means that that there is a signal, there's a messaging there that this may go well beyond Donbass, even after the Donbass campaign. So we need to, first point I need to mention is this, that we need to look beyond this, beyond the conflict. When we look at the situation beyond the conflict, how it impacts on the world order, everything depends on how the military situation evolves. Secondly, it has been mentioned by the just earlier that the European situation is getting complicated. Evidently, a very serious error was there in their judgment that they could have a sort of punitive sanctions from hell, and destroy Russia and can get away with it. Russia was, of course, very well prepared, and Russia had maintained also that this is not going to be such an easy thing. There will be repercussions, and it will come as a shock, and it is coming. Even in America, there is a repercussions of these sanctions thing, the distortions that have introduced into the interdependency between Europe and Russia on energy matters particularly. So you see, these are only going to get more acute in the period ahead. And inflation is rising, it's at an unprecedented level, cost of living is rising. I really don't know, but I believe yesterday I said that 1 pint of beer is costing 8 pounds in Britain. So this is the kind of situation that is developing. Energy, gasoline price in the United States, which is very important for an American in his day-to-day life, a factor. Then there is the election coming up in America. So the compulsions on President Biden in the coming period, all this taken into account, the Western world is also in turmoil as a result of it. And at the same time, they are not in a position to retreat from that. But partly we are seeing a certain grudging realization that some places there has to be a retreat, like Americans are contemplating a moderation of the sanctions regime so that wheat and food grains can flow from Russia to the world market. So it's a specific instance, but at the same time, it's a realization that the food crisis that is developing in the world is polemics apart, that you can attribute everything to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but there is a realization that the sanctions have got something to do with this. So you see, this is how long this can continue like this remains to be seen. There are certain cracks in the Western unity which are visible. Even within the European Union, the difficulty in coming to a consensus on oil embargo against Russia is the best illustration of that. So this will only deepen in the period ahead. And if the calculation in Washington was that this kind of a confrontation with Russia would consolidate the unity of the Western powers and also strengthen their transatlantic leadership, there may be unpleasant surprises in the period ahead. Now, if we will see what happens in the NATO summit, the reports say that Japanese Prime Minister is attending. It's the first time that Japan may be attending a NATO summit, which is a clear indication that NATO is preparing to move toward the so-called Indo-Pacific arena. And if that happens, the American calculation is that this same kind of approach can be repeated in Indo-Pacific. So you see, I am looking forward to listening to our distinguished thinker and scholar from China on how he sees this. So when you look at it that way, the situation is very dangerous. Russians are having a military exercises at the moment in the Pacific. There has been a joint air patrol between Russia and China. All these are, signs of the shape of things to come, possibly. So you see, for the Americans, a defeat in Ukraine will mean that their decline will accelerate, and a re-establishment of their hegemony will be out of the question. It will be finished once and for all. And their leadership of the Western Alliance, the NATO's future, all this are factors involved in it. So the struggle ahead is going to be extremely serious. If, on the other hand, if Russia asserts and Russia prevails in Ukraine, many of these wonderful thoughts that we listened to earlier, these will prevail also in terms of a multipolar world order, in terms of a break from the dollar supremacy and the kind of tyranny that the United States is exercised through weaponization of sanctions, appropriating the wealth of other countries unilaterally, without any regard for international law, without even caring to justify that act. All these things will become very difficult, and we will be then moving toward a much more democratized world order where big and small countries all will have equal rights, and it will be difficult for any single power to force its will on the world community. I will stop at this because I want to listen to the visitor from China, and also in the question and answer session, I'm sure we will get opportunity to discuss this at greater length. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will speak right away, or?
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, Magna, for your kind introduction. And thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your very thoughtful ideas, comments on the Ukraine crisis. And I will here discuss with you this whole idea of the China model of development and the China model of democracy, all from a civilizational state perspective. And then I will comment briefly on the Ukraine crisis. And China's dramatic rise has indeed catch the attention worldwide. China now is the world's largest economy by purchasing power parity. It's already, by PPP, purchasing power parity, 20% larger than the US economy. It's also the world's largest trading nation and with the world's largest, most comprehensive manufacturing industries. And what's more important, as a socialist country, China has eradicated extreme poverty across this vast country and has achieved compulsory education for all, housing for all, medical insurance and pension for all. With a life expectancy, I just checked this morning, higher than United States. By the end of the year 2020, China life expectancy 77.9, United States is 77. China is also at the forefront of the fourth industrial revolution in 5G, big data, AI, and quantum technologies. China is also at the forefront and the leader in the renewable energy in terms of both investment and output. Of course, China has its share of problems, some of which are very serious and require dedicated solutions. But China's overall success is beyond doubt. And how to explain this success? Some claim it's due to foreign direct investment. But in comparison, in fact, many Eastern European countries has attracted far more FDI, especially in per capita terms, than China. And some claim that it's due to the abundance of cheap labor. Yet, in fact, most developing countries today offer cheaper labor than China. Some claims due to the authoritarian political system. But by Western standards, there are many authoritarian states in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Arab world, etc. Yet, most of them have not yet performed that well as China does. So if these explanations cannot explain China's success, we should think beyond the box. To my mind, it has to do with the fundamental nature of China as a state, as a civilizational state, and the Chinese model of development and Chinese system of democracy. China is in many ways a unique country. It's a civilizational state, which means it's an amalgamation of world's longest continuous civilization with a super large modern state. And the country was first unified in 221 BC. It's an amalgam of four factors, namely a super large population like India, 1/5 of mankind, a super sized territory, it's a continent, super long traditions, virtue with tradition in every branch of human knowledge, and a super rich culture, very diverse culture. And these four supers have largely shaped China's model of development and its system of democracy. And one characteristic of the civilizational state, as in the case of China, is the combination of the old and the new in all the features of its model. Let's first focus on China's model of development. And the China model is guided by a philosophy called seeking truth from facts. It's an ancient Chinese concept dating from the Han Dynasty, which means around 200 BC. Yet it's revived by Chairman Mao and Chairman Deng Xiaoping, in China's revolution and the modernization drive. Basically, they believe that facts, rather than ideological dogmas, whether from the East or from the West, should serve as the ultimate criteria for establishing truth. So through examining historical and contemporary facts, China concluded that neither the Soviet model of communism nor the Western model of liberal democracy could lead a huge country, developing country like China, to its dream of national revival and modernization. So China decided to explore its own way of development and modernization, and adopted a pragmatic trial and error approach to explore socialism with the Chinese characteristics, and largely succeeded. And another feature of the China model of development is called the people's livelihood first. It's also a well-tested concept from ancient China, from ancient China's political governance philosophy. In today's context, people's livelihood first means whatever the party or the state does, political, economic, or social policies, they must all boil down to deliver tangible benefits, material and non-material, to the people. And the China model values what you can deliver to the people, the kind of can-do spirit, rather than indulgence in empty talks. In the United States, you have Obama, President Obama. He came to power with the slogan, change. Yet 8 years passed of his 2 terms, but without much change. This is inconceivable in China. And the third feature of the China model is its mixed economy, or in the official expression, socialist market economy. China has tried to combine the strengths of the market invisible hand with the visible hand of the state intervention. So along with the market force, the Chinese state has managed to ensure, on the whole, a kind of macro political stability and economic stability, steering the country away from financial crisis and other crises. The mixed economy model China is still exploring is not perfect. It has its problems. But in international comparison, since its inception in the year 1992, China is the only major world economy, one of the largest economies in the world that has not experienced financial crisis or economic crisis as these crises are understood in the West. And people's living standards are rising much faster than anywhere in the world. The country's contribution to the growth of the world economy is roughly 30% for many years running, even now, larger than the combined contribution of the US, Europe, and Japan for the growth of the world economy. Now let's come to the Chinese model of democracy. It is widely assumed in the Western political narrative that state legitimacy comes from universal suffrage and multi-party competitive elections. Yet this assumption may raise 2 issues. First, historically, it's not true, as universal suffrage is a recent development, a recent phenomenon. One can claim, for instance, the US state has no legitimacy prior to 1965, as African blacks, African Americans had not been allowed to vote prior to 1965. Furthermore, this practice, universal suffrage, is confined only to nation states. It will be very difficult to imagine that, say, the European Union could establish its legitimacy this way and still play its steering role or unifying role. Anyway, EU is going way down now with the Ukraine crisis. And these 2 issues help us better understand why the Chinese sense of legitimacy is vastly different from the Western one. For China is not a typical nation state, but rather a civilizational state. And its sense of legitimacy is deeply rooted in its own historical traditions and shaped over the 2 millennia, at least, since the country was first unified under the Emperor Qing in 221 BC. For instance, China's one-party governance today, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, meet with a lot of criticism in the West. Yet, to most Chinese, it's nothing extraordinary. For most of the past 2,000 years, China has been governed by a kind of unified ruling entity, a kind of one-party system, if you wish. Otherwise, the country disintegrates. And China indeed copied the American political model following its Republican Revolution in 1911. And then the country degenerated into civil wars, into warlords fighting each other. And behind these warlords were European powers, etc. But China's unified ruling entity has been buttressed by a system of meritocracy, with officials selected through public exams. China invented this system. It's called the clergy system in the Sui dynasty, which was close to 1,500 years ago, and which this kind of system, claimed to represent or genuinely represent the most, if not all, people under heaven in the Chinese universe. And furthermore, during much of this unified ruling entity or one-party rule, China was arguably a much better governed country, more peaceful, more prosperous than the European states of the same epoch. And China began to lag behind the European countries, roughly starting from the 18th century, when China closed its door to the outside world and China missed the Industrial Revolution. And three key concepts have underpinned the Chinese sense of state legitimacy. The first is Confucian doctrine of the mandate of heaven, which has prevailed since the Han Dynasty or 200 BC. Confucius, China's philosophical sage, Confucius admonished Chinese rulers that water can carry a boat, but also overturn the boat, which meant that unless the rulers worked with diligence to ensure good governance, with a particular emphasis I mentioned just now, focus on people's livelihood, then ordinary people could rise up and rebel in the name of heaven. In other words, the Chinese mandate of heaven was not a God-given right. The people's acceptance of the ruler's legitimacy rested on the condition that the rulers had to perform and deliver. So this is the Chinese idea of so-called social contract between the ruler and the ruled. In other words, almost 2,000 years earlier than the French philosopher Rousseau's theory on social contract. And the Chinese model today has adapted this idea into a sense of mission to achieve the Chinese dream of building a prosperous and developed socialist country. So as a result, you can check the facts. The Chinese state has presided over the world's fastest economic growth and improving of the living standards in human history. Virtually all independent surveys, including those by PU Research Center, by Ipsos, all these internationally well-known research centers, their surveys found that Chinese state commands a high degree of respect and support within China. For instance, the Ipsos survey in the year 2020 showed that 91% Chinese believe the country is on the right track, while only 41% Americans and 21% of British feel the same way about their countries. And the second concept is related to the mandate of heaven. It is idea and the practice of meritocracy, and which literally should be translated into 选贤任, appointing the virtuous and the competent. So I mentioned this Chinese ancient clergy system or civil service examination system. Now this system has been adapted by the Chinese Communist Party into what I call selection plus election, selecting its leaders based on morality and performance. For example, if you look at the composition of China's top echelon leaders, they have virtually all served at least twice as number one of a Chinese province, which literally means, given the size of China, they have administered, say, a population of over 100 million people or more before they were promoted to the current top echelon positions. So this is selection plus election. And this is obviously to many Chinese better than simply relying on election. And the third concept of legitimacy derives from the Chinese, again, philosophy of political governance, there are two distinctive concepts in Chinese. One is called Ming Yi, the other is called Ming Xing. Ming Yi literally means public opinion, or it can be roughly translated into this public opinion. And Ming Yi is more difficult to translate, approximately something like the hearts and minds of the people. So these two concepts were put forward by Chinese philosopher Mencius about 300 years before BC. And public opinion of Ming Yi can be fleeting in today's world, can change overnight, especially in this internet age. But the Ming Xing, or the hearts and minds of people, tend to be much more stable and lasting, reflecting in the language of political science, the long-term interest of a nation. So on the whole, the Chinese state has been able to practice rule by Ming Xing, the long-term interest of the people. So that allowed the Chinese model to effectively overcome short-termism, which was so much prevalent in the Western democracies and in many countries that adopt the Western political model. And the Chinese model can plan for the future, for the medium to long term, and even for next generation, rather than just for next 100 days or next election. So the Chinese experience shows that the ultimate test of a good political system is its quality, is how well it can ensure good governance, as judged by the people of that country. I all along advocate the view that we should usher in a paradigm shift from this outdated Cold War paradigm of so-called democracy versus autocracy to that of good governance versus bad governance. And good governance can take the form of the Western political model, but it can also take the form of non-Western political model, as in the case of China. Likewise, bad governance can also take the form of Western political model. That's important. I can give you 100 examples in this regard as I traveled to more than 100 countries. I did field study. Of course, it can also take non-Western political system. I remember when the Capitol Hill riot occurred in the United States on January 6th last year. A tweet went viral in many countries, including China. If the United States saw what's happening on the Capitol Hill, the United States would invade the United States to liberate the United States from the tyranny of the United States. Another tweet also went viral. This is the first coup d'etat that happened in Americas without the participation of the US embassy. And we can also quote the famous line from Abraham Lincoln, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and compare the quality of governance or the quality of democracy, China versus the United States. Concerning for the people, according to the Democracy Perception Index 2020, conducted by Rasmussen Global and Dahlia Research, 87% Chinese believe their government work for majority, while only 48% Americans think so, and 52% Americans surveyed believe the American government serves a minority. Concerning of the people, official data shows that 90% of China's civil servants come from ordinary family background. While for the United States, I don't have the exact figure, but let me quote the famous line from Nobel laureate Professor Stiglitz. The US now is of the 1%, by the 1%, and for the 1%. Concerning by the people, as I have already discussed above, I think that the American model is at best a procedural democracy, which may have nothing to do with real democracy or with substantial democracy. For instance, China has practiced selection plus election, which is not perfect. We are still trying to working to improve it, but it's indeed better than the American model of election only. And this also reflected in the latest PW survey that 72% of Americans don't think American model is a good model of democracy for other countries. So it's really a kind of internal implosion. Many Americans don't feel their model is working well. It follows that from the Chinese point of view, the nature of a state, including its legitimacy, has to be defined more by its substance, that is good governance, acknowledged, recognized by people of that country, rather than simply by correct procedures. China emphasizes substance over procedures, believing that the ultimate pursuit of the right substance will involve naturally the right procedures of democracy, appropriate to each country's national conditions and other conditions. 11 years ago, when Arab Spring occurred, I had a debate with Professor Fukuyama, the author of The End of History and The Last Man, in Shanghai. And you can find the text of debate on the website, on the internet. Fukuyama predicted China may also experience its own version of Arab Spring. I said, no chance. On the other hand, the Arab Spring will soon become Arab Winter. In the end, it became, from my point of view and the views of many others, became Arab Winter. He argued that China should embrace political reform to adopt a Western political model. I said that both China and the United States need political reforms, but to my mind, with my knowledge of US political system, US history, the United States needs political reform more urgently than China. And the American political system is a product of pre-industrial era. Again, I made a prediction. I said, otherwise, without substantial political reform, the United States may produce a leader worse off than George W. Bush. I made this prediction 11 years ago. It turned out to be true, at least in the eyes of many people. I also predicted a few years ago about the British democracy. I said, you must carry out substantial political reform. Otherwise, Great Britain may become Little Britain. Indeed, to most Chinese today, having witnessed its 2008 financial crisis of the United States, its United States COVID debacle, its massive gun violence, its failure of Afghanistan, etc. Indeed, American democracy to most Chinese is increasingly like American joke. And still the Americans love to lecture Chinese, lecture us. Of course, we are more than happy to lecture them back. United States is obviously on the wrong side of history. Its decline may accelerate unless it embraces serious political reform to free itself as much as possible from this control and influence and even the yoke of the military-industrial complex and from the Wall Streets. Finally, let me say a few words about the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. Indeed, the overall reaction to this conflict reveals a lot about our world today. For instance, you find a clear divide between the West and the rest, or a divide between the West and the non-West. The West has adopted heavy sanctions on Russia, and the non-West are overwhelmingly against these sanctions. Virtually all major non-Western countries like China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, and the whole Islamic world. In other words, most peoples in the world do not support Western sanctions, and they believe that the issue is much more complicated, and they place a lot of blame on the unwanted NATO aggressive eastward expansion. In other words, the non-Western world may be divided on Russia's military action, but they are more or less united in favor of Russia's another objective, that is to transform the unipolar world order dominated by the United States into a multipolar world order. And they also believe this is a irreversible trend of history. Okay, I will stop here, and I thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both the speakers. Before we begin, I would like to ask Ambassador Bhadrakumar if he would like to respond in any way to Dr. Zhang Weiwei's presentation, and then I'll ask some of the discussants to speak.
Well, you know, I listened with great interest, but the last thing I would have is a difference of opinion on the main thoughts that Professor had outlined here. I also believe that there is really no set model of democracy, and prescribing a particular model as superior just doesn't make sense. And if at all any yardstick is to be applied, it should be in terms of the deliverability of a certain order, a political system. Unless its capacity to deliver, winning hearts and minds, as the professor said in the Chinese thought, you know, that this is an ancient thought in China. This is very important. A few times that I traveled in China, I was given a lot of opportunity, in fact, to talk to ordinary people. And I had never served there as a diplomat, but on various occasions I traveled there. I asked them about this, about their feeling about the Chinese Communist Party. And uniformly, I got the sense that the legitimacy of the party is derived from their firm conviction that the party has delivered. And looking ahead, they are confident that whatever is being promised is going to be delivered. The third aspect I noticed was this, that there is a sense of optimism that life has improved a lot over 2-3 generations that have gone compared to 2-3 generations back. And there is a conviction, there is a belief, there is a faith, in fact, that things would even be better tomorrow. Now, so if at all we are to apply any yardstick, I think this has to be on this line about the capacity to deliver, and thereof a certain connectivity is established between the system and the people. Holding elections with a certain regularity is not really the be-all and end-all of democracy. I think it's only the beginning, that that kind of a choice is given to the people. Personally, I believe it also has its importance that it gives a certain sense of empowerment to the people. And therefore, it gives a certain sense of involvement to the people. But then beyond that, looking ahead, there is a saga of accountability, of transparency, of responsiveness, of performance, effective performance, sensitivity to popular opinion. All these things are there. So broadly, I'm inclined to go along with what the professor said, that the kind of wisdom that China accumulated over millennia, these are very important today. They are very relevant today, and they are relevant also to a lot of other countries, a lot of other nations. I leave it at that. My response to it. Let us develop this further in the Q&A.
Yes, before I open it up for everybody, first of all, if people who would like to speak would turn their video on so we can see you. But there are three distinguished guests in particular who we would like to have as discussants. One is Sudhendra Kulkarniji, who is the ex-advisor to the Prime Minister of India. The other is Martin Jacques, author of When China Rules the World and prominent commentator who has spoken at our events in the past. And also Dr. Anthony Montero, who is a scholar of W.E.B. Du Bois and of African American studies in Philadelphia. So I would like any of these three to begin. Perhaps Sudhendra Kulkarniji can start.
Thank you. And let me begin by expressing my appreciation for the organizers of this function, and appreciation also for the two main speakers. Since time is short, I was a little disappointed that the discussion or dialogue did not focus on inter-civilizational dialogue on democracy in the sense of India-China dialogue on democracy. There was a comparison between the West and China, and much of that comparison is, of course, valid. But there was very little focus on democracy in another civilizational nation, that is India. It is unfortunate that not just this particular event, but to the best of my knowledge, there is no platform, official, unofficial, where we are having any dialogue between India and China on democracy. Actually, on democracy, official India finds itself closer to the West than to China, even though we are both Asian civilizations and we have so much in common, but in our political systems and in the way we practice democracy, India finds itself, both for historical reasons and also for some contemporary reasons, we seem to be closer to the West. An example of this is the fact that in the introductory mission statement, a mention was made of the democracy summit hosted by the American President Joe Biden. Friends, India participated in this summit. Prime Minister Modi spoke at this summit. But Prime Minister Modi, who's had so many meetings with President Xi Jinping, there has been never any event in which India and China have had a dialogue on democracy, which is very unfortunate. West, as was mentioned, is not really, it doesn't have a great civilizational heritage. The United States, of course, there is no civilization at all. So if there is an inter-civilizational dialogue on democracy, it has to be principally between India and China. India has a lot to learn from China, but I would also submit very strongly that China has a lot to learn from India. India is a vibrant but defective democracy. China is a vibrant, rising nation, rising in so many areas, but with a truncated democracy. And I would like at some point in the remaining session, the Chinese Professor Weiwe, to tell us what kind of political reforms China should have or China could have in the years to come. The main reason for the lack of any dialogue between India and China on democracy is well known. It is our bilateral dispute, which has really, which has become a wall that separates us on any kind of meaningful cooperation. And therefore, we have to find an early answer, an amicable answer to the border dispute, without which our two civilizations cannot really have a meaningful dialogue and substantive cooperation, which can then benefit us and benefit the rest of the world. Of course, India needs good governance. India needs better delivery of development. These are two areas where China scores way ahead of India. But if Indian people were given a choice, either good governance, better delivery of development, or elective democracy, I can tell you, friends, that Indian people will say, we want elective democracy to continue, which means that the Indian path to making our democracy better, more mature, is by not giving up what we have, but by learning from China on what China is doing better on. And perhaps Chinese could learn from India on many aspects of democracy. So I stop here, but just to repeat, if our learned professor from China, if he could tell us, he really gave a very very enlightening discourse on China as a civilization state, and how the Chinese system has incorporated the best of their history and their culture and their philosophy. All this is fine, but are there aspects of political reforms that China needs, and how these reforms could be implemented in the years to come? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would also like to ask Martin Jock and Dr. Montero to give their remarks.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Congratulations, first of all, to the organizers on this initiative. I very much enjoyed the two speeches from Ambassador Bhadrakumar and from my old friend, Professor Zhang Weiwei, because we're all mates. It's nice to see him again. The first thing I want to say really is that I do endorse what Sudin Kulkarni has just said. I do think that the question of India-China relations is really important, and strategically it will gain more importance, not just with the rise of China, but also with the rise of India. And I think the dialogue that's required is not just about democracy. I think that that's one element, sure, but I think the question also is to understand each other's civilizations. I mean, I say this as a British person who's unfortunately historically been a thorn in the side of both countries, and I apologize for that, but I can't personally take that much responsibility because this is a big question. But I really think this would be really important, and it's quite right that there are the relationship is troubled at the moment, and so it has to be addressed. It can't be skirted around, because there are differences. I think the border obviously is very central to this, but I don't think it's just the border. I don't. I think it's much more complex. I mean, these are both India and China are civilization states, but that begs the question, well, what kind of civilization states they are? And they are rather different. And that's very interesting. So there should be a really big, a major dialogue, which I hope you can kick off, but I think it's got to be done on a much bigger scale. And at the moment, you know, neither country seems to me to be very regarded as important enough to do it. On the contrary, I think it's absolutely central priority. In 50 years' time, this relationship will probably be the most important relationship in the world, if not before that. So I endorse the sentiments that have been expressed in relationship to this. Well, I don't want to take time. I think, you know, it's much more interesting to listen to Indian and Chinese speakers, but than me drolling on with my my white face and my European belonging. I just want to say two things. One, you know, I don't think actually the United States is capable of reinventing itself in any meaningful historical period. You know, when countries go into decline, they don't actually recover in the near future. It takes a long time, and I think this will be true of the United States. I mean, my country it has been incapable of reinventing itself in a really serious way ever since its decline started. You can date it from whenever you want to, 1900, 1918, 1945, but it hasn't been able to do it, and it's not able to do it. And so it's, you know, hence its decline is really historically dramatic. But we're talking about America here, and I think that America just cannot imagine itself as anything other than it is now. So there's a huge failure of imagination, which is not just at the political level, but it is at the popular level. You know, Americans cannot imagine their country not being number one in the world. So this is why, you know, this explains Trump. It explains the shift in American thinking since 2016, that it cannot bear the idea that China could possibly be able to or be allowed to become on a par with the United States, let alone overtake the United States. And I just think, can I just add one very broad historical point here? And that is, actually, when Westerners talk about choice and all this kind of thing, you know, and China lacks it, I think that choice is viewed in a very narrow way, not just in this kind of political party business, but also the way in which countries choose. This is a bigger question. Are countries capable of reinventing themselves? And actually, the country by far in the world, the civilization by far in the world that's shown itself most capable of reinventing itself is China. Because there have been 5 times, probably historically speaking, when China has been one of or the most advanced country in the world. That is an extraordinary ability. What is it about China? Well, it's got definitely something deep in the roots of Chinese civilization that has enabled this to be possible. My final point is this, because I mustn't go on, and that is about the Ukraine. I mean, I agree what the ambassador said about the dangers of this situation. I think they are very dangerous. They're very fraught. There's always been a hidden forces in this dispute. Hidden, you know, the role, what happened in 2014, the coup d'état, the way the agreements reached between the United States and Ukraine, the steady shift there, and so on. There's been, and so we shouldn't be surprised by this. It's not just Ukraine versus Russia; it's Ukraine plus the United States and its European allies versus Russia. I mean, I speak here, by the way, someone who was opposed to what Russia did, but I'm not a fool enough to think that that's the end of the matter. On the contrary, the reason why Russia acted like it did was this prehistory, if you like, in relationship to it. But the thing I want to emphasize here is that we have entered a new period of history now. We've entered, we call it what you will, a new era. We've entered the age of instability. We've entered a period of history where the only certainty is uncertainty. Why? It seems to me the underlying factor, these are always multi-causal, but the underlying reason is the decline of the United States. So basically, the international order is unraveling. In some senses slowly, in other senses very quickly. So countries are acting, and I don't think Putin would have done this 10 years ago, for example. And other countries, all the way around the world, you can see countries taking their own initiative because they no longer think the United States is in a position of authority and it was in the way that it was previously. Now, if you want a parallel to explain this, what's happening, it is what happened between 1918 and 1939, when Britain was the global hegemon, but was incapable any longer of playing that role, increasingly during the 1920s. In the Great Depression, 1931, it finally buckled and it could no longer do it. And there was no country to take its place because America at that point was not prepared to do it. It was not until 1945 that the Americans were interested in doing something like this. And the result was, as you can see, basically a huge breakdown of the international system. And I think that that is the process in a different way, in a different period we're going through now. Hopefully, as will not end up, this period will not end up in the calamitous way that disaggregation and fragmentation of the international system ended up with blocks, protectionist blocks, and eventually, of course, war. But we should be warned that this is a very dangerous period, and no one is in control of it because, you know, it's too complex for anyone to be in control of it. But I just wanted to add that because that, you know, think of the Ukraine dispute in that kind of context. That's why it's so dangerous. Thank you.
Dr. Montero.
Thank you very much. I don't have the words to express my joy at being a part of this and being a witness to this inter-civilizational dialogue on democracy. I think at the heart of the, as my Chinese colleague mentioned, the paradigm shift is the question of democracy, which in generic terms means the rule of the people. Coming as I do from the United States, I would insist that this dialogue between India and China must become a world inter-civilizational dialogue about the paths to people's rule, to the governance of people, by people, and for the people. So this is not of minor interest. This dialogue between India and China, this inter-civilizational dialogue, is of great interest to growing parts of the American population. I'd like to explain that. But let me just say a few things. In 1959, W.E.B. Du Bois, speaking at Peking University, gave a speech, and in part he said, Africa, learn from China. In that same year, Martin Luther King Jr., the great leader of America's third revolution, the civil rights or Black freedom movement, which again, as my Chinese colleague mentioned, for the first time, American democracy looked something like more than just procedural or word democracy, with Black people finally in 1965 getting the right to vote. But the great Martin Luther King in 1959 on a visit to India, paying homage to the Indian anti-colonial struggle and to Mahatma Gandhi, said in effect to the American people, learn from India. And I take what those two figures said to heart. Myself and many, many more people in this country than are generally acknowledged want to know more about India and more about China because we believe we have a great deal to learn from Asia. I do agree also that India and China, the Indian-Chinese states, are more contemporary states than is the US state. The American state is a product of the 18th century, where European nations, European capitalist nations, were only recently into the industrial age. In fact, if somebody is to lecture someone else, it seems that Asians have a legitimate right in terms of the contemporary world to instruct us about the modern state. And even Jean-Jacques Rousseau's notion of the social contract, which the substance of which does not really exist in the United States. And the interesting thing is that the American people in vast numbers realize that the ruling elite of the United States serves its own interests and not those of the American people. As to the question of can America be reformed, I think we have to make certain distinctions. That is not a question that will be answered by the ruling elite of the United States. They more or less say there is no need for fundamental reform. On the other side, growing numbers of American people are saying the opposite. Now, there is not a clear voice at this point, but the discontent is so palpable and so deep and so profound that it is not going too far to say that a situation separating the state from the people, the elite from the people, this kind of division has not existed since the American Civil War of 1861, 1865, and this crisis might go beyond that. The divide between the elite and the American people is deeper, perhaps, than in any country, modern country in the world. Another way to say this, the political crisis faced by the ruling elite of the United States exceeds the crises, political crises that exist anywhere in the world. This is the country whose ruling class claims to govern democratically. The people don't believe it. The transition from what in essence is an authoritarianism clothed in language of democracy quite an irony, I have to say, it makes you laugh. Authoritarianism, with a practice of electoral democracy, most times very corrupt and so on, with a vast propaganda machinery that says to the American people and to the world's people, don't believe what you experience, believe what we're telling you. And the American people don't believe it anymore. In US political science, this is what is called a crisis of legitimacy. And that is what we face. Lenin, if you don't mind me bringing his name up, called it a situation where the ruling class cannot rule in the old way and the people will not accept being ruled in the old way. Let me just give a couple of indicators of where we are. Let me just say, first of all, we are not on the cusp of a revolutionary situation. We are in a crisis, an economic crisis, the vastness and depth of which official statistics and official government statements do not address. Inflation as it relates to prices affecting the working people of this country is way beyond 8.5%. We're talking about double-digit inflation. Everyone knows, when I say everyone, I'm talking about ordinary working people know that we are on the cusp of a recession, an economic downturn that might go beyond 2008, coupled with inflation, a catastrophe, the likes of which our people have not experienced since the Great Depression of the 1930s. This coupled with war and war spending. Let me say a couple of things, because the propaganda of the US elite is so ubiquitous and so targeted and sophisticated that there's certain facts that people might not know. First of all, America, the American people as a whole, are less racist today than they were 50 years ago at the height of the civil rights movement. In other words, the Third American Revolution, the Black Freedom Movement, the Civil Rights Movement, this great human rights project did affect the consciousness and still affects the consciousness in an evolving and maturing way of the American people, Black, white, Asian, Latino, and so on. The American people are more of a unified people today than we were 50 years ago. That does not mean that we are where we must be or must go, but we are not this racist population. That is propaganda. Are there racists in the United States? Yes, there are a lot of racists. Are there people that don't like Black people? Yes, there are a lot of people that don't like Black people. But when you measure historical movements of consciousness, America is less racist today than it was 50 years ago. Names such as Martin Luther King, Muhammad Ali, Coretta Scott King, the great artists and musicians have impacted the minds and hearts of the American people. We are not the same. The other thing, anti-war sentiment. This might come as shocking news to a lot of people, and it probably should, because of what American propaganda does not say about the American people. The American people are today more anti-war than we were at the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement. Let me repeat that. The American people are less predisposed to war and war propaganda today than we were at the height of the struggle against the war in Vietnam. I would argue that outside of a very formal processual matters, America is a very limited democracy, if a democracy at all. I am from Philadelphia. I invite my colleagues from England and from China and from India and anywhere else, come to Philadelphia. I will personally give you a tour of this 5th largest city in the United States, and I will show you concretely what the policies of the US ruling class have done to the people of this city. And I could take you to Chicago or New York, but I'm saying the city that I know. Drug addiction and open air drug selling on a magnitude and level that we have never seen in this city. Violence, gun violence. I'm not only talking about Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde in Texas. I'm talking about across every city in this country. People fear going outside of their homes. But the ruling elite of Philadelphia continues to build tall skyscrapers in the center of the city where homelessness is widespread, drug addiction is widespread, and anxiety and fear of violence is widespread. The ruling class of this country does not even become embarrassed at this and does not even pretend to want to serve the people. There is no social contract, no obligation on the part of the government, of the ruling elite, to deliver and serve the people. There is hardly a public education system that we could call such. Most students, well, let me put it this way, 46% of all students in Philadelphia's public schools drop out before they graduate from high school. And most who graduate are functionally illiterate, cannot read, can barely count. They are a group of people who look very much like a lumpen proletariat, a precariat, a generation of young Black and brown and white people, youth who have no future. I mean, okay, let me just end here. Sure. This is America. It is 2 Americas or 3 Americas. It is America of a population that is not what it was 50, 60 years ago, and the potentiality of the American people are greater today. For change will be difficult, but the possibilities of change are there. We must fight for them. I'm sorry I went too long, Meg.
Thank you so much, Dr. Montero. Before I open it up, or I would ask the panelists to respond, I just wanted to call on one of the organizers of the event, Nandita Chaturvedi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nandita. I just wanted to comment on a few things that were raised. First of all, I think that, Kulkarni ji said that he raised the point of why we're addressing the West so much And I just want to stress that no dialogue on peace in Asia is possible unless you address the role of the West. And, it is true, and I think we can all agree that the West is in decline. However, they still control most of the major universities in the world. They control the education of the world's elite, and they also control the means of information in the world. So I think that in any dialogue on peace between India and China, one has to discuss the West and in particular the United States. The second thing that I wanted to address was this question of whether India is close to the West or whether it is close to China. And I think that if you look at the Indian state superficially, you can argue that it's close to the West. However, the Indian state is a product of the Indian freedom struggle. And the Indian freedom struggle was a synthesis of all of India's traditions and history, much in the same way that Professor Zhang talked about the Chinese Revolution. And I think it would be a mistake to think that the Indian state is parallel to American liberal democracy. And in particular, I think you can see this in the leadership of Gandhi and the fact that the Indian people chose Gandhi, not through elections, but through a movement, a mass movement. And I think that, we were saddled with a colonial administration when power was transferred after the revolution to Nehru's government. We were saddled with many institutions that had colonial history, including the judiciary, which blocked many radical land reforms. And, we can go into this, but I just wanted to make the point that I think it would be a mistake to superficially compare the Indian electoral system to the West liberal democracy. And I would argue that, I think it's an open question how to characterize India's state, but I would argue that it is in many ways civilizational. The last thing I wanted to say was that I think this is a beginning, and I think that in dialogues such as this, it is not important how many people are in attendance all of the time. It is more important what ideas are discussed. And I think we should not underestimate the importance of ideas in clarifying the direction for the future. So yeah, I just wanted to say that, and I hope the panelists can also respond.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to ask Ambassador Bhadrakumar and Dr. Weiwe for their response. Also, I just wanted to check with Dr. Weiwe. I know it's getting to be 9 p.m. Is that a very hard stop for you? Because we have many questions, a lot of engagement.
No problem.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so do go ahead, Ambassador Bhadrakumar and Dr. Weiwe.
I had my say. Let me listen to Professor Shah.
Well, concerning this issue raised by Mr. Kulkarni, to what extent, China and India should learn from each other and know each other better. Indeed, although our two countries are neighbors for thousands of years, there are not yet enough mutual understanding, which is a pity. And concerning this Chinese model of political governance, as I said, governing philosophy is seeking truth from facts. In other words, you should first of all try to know what people want most. Then you establish a list of priorities. In the case of China, for many years, it's eradicating poverty. Yeah, and gradually have other. Now it will be closing more and more these wealth gaps, etc. So, in other words, the Chinese model or basic feature of China model is you do all kinds of study and survey to know exactly what people want, and then establish a list, and then do accordingly 1, 2, 3, 4. Say fighting poverty, and the closing income gap, housing issue. So the Chinese democracy is highlighted by this feature. If you look at the every year, we have what's called the two sessions: the session of the National People's Congress, which is Chinese Parliament, and the session of the People's Consultative Conference, which is more or less like the Senate of other countries. Usually, in the National Congress, the Chinese Prime Minister will produce a work report in which he will give the list of do list for the next year, say 10 things we are going to accomplish. And then he will also check on the list that for last year, to what extent we are fulfilled, over-fulfilled, or haven't fulfilled. So it's a very serious business. It's you make a promise, you will do 10 things, and then you do fulfill these 10 tasks and challenges. That's why the country is making faster progress. Indeed, in China, even including myself, been to India 3 or 4 times. We haven't got enough time to discuss India's political system. For most Chinese scholars, we, for one reason or another, group India's democracy as part of the Western model, as practiced in the developing country. Many Chinese actually study India more on the rise of India, its software industry, etc. There are quite a few studies in China, which is well circulated. I think from this discussion, maybe as both China and India now say we are civilizational states, and as Martin Jacques just mentioned, what kind of civilization state India and China? So this could be an interesting topic for, say, next round of discussion. Yeah, I will just say this at this moment.
I would just like to read 2 questions from the chat and
Yes,
ask for your responses. One is from Neha CV. The emphasis on civilizational basis of government is at the core of finding unique solutions. How can a state like India rebuild this faith in our history and philosophy through political discourse? Another one that I will take is how would a 21st century Indian civilizational state in a multipolar world look like? Like China, what civilizational concept of governance, statehood, and people's rule be applied for fuller people's rule? Whoever wants to address that.
That's for India scholars.
Ambassador Bhadrakumar, would you want to?
Well, I don't have that degree of optimism that Suzindraji had. So it's very difficult to respond, and because he's far more experienced than I am, and he's been an activist, and he's still an activist, whereas I am only an observer. And some 40 years of my life, I was observing also an entirely different sphere of activity. But I have a doubt, whether we can so confidently say that Indian people would any day prefer their existing system in lieu of, the kind of trajectory that China followed successfully with phenomenal success. I really don't know, because that kind of, first of all, that kind of stock taking doesn't take place in India. And there are no benchmarks to be put there to fathom the sentiments of the people. It is more or less, it is similar to what has been explained by Professor Montero about the gloomy situation in the United States. Of course, I'm not comparing the two democracies, but quintessentially there is a similarity there, because there is a disconnect and we cannot overlook it. And I don't know to what extent, otherwise, all these things become very esoteric. To what extent are these things relevant when, after getting elected and the mandate is there, the people, from the people, something else entirely different taking place. I can see that, as an observer of international politics, I can see that what Professor Montero said, I listened to with great interest, because that is the kind of disconnect which is there in India also. So whether, the people are really stoically accepting it because they can't do anything about it, or they are consciously preferring it, as Sudhindraji mentioned, I'm not very sure. Personally, from my point of view, I think all these trammels of democracy, which we bandy about as the largest democracy in the world, I think these are inconsequential for a very significant section of our population, because it's a grim reality, and therefore, unless that is meaningfully addressed, I don't know whether India is even ready for a discussion on democracy. And the unfortunate part is, apart from the trammels, there has been, number one, a lot of degeneration taking place. And that degeneration, there is no corrective action taking place. Look at, for instance, political parties. There is no inner party democracy in India. Now, so, you are being made to, you are given a multiple choice, all right, but a choice which is almost prearranged, and where you have no say. So there are a lot of problems there, I said in the beginning, therefore, that I believe that there is really no ideal format, and certainly the Western format is not what we practice in India today. It will be wrong on our part to say that, that we have a greater affinity with the Western world. I don't think our practice of democracy is, it is probably more akin in the sense that, like it is in the US, the elites, go their own way, and there is no accountability, and they don't relate to the people except when election time comes. But I was greatly attracted to what I saw in China, frankly speaking. That is a very candid admission on my part.
So before we end, I would like to invite the speakers on the Zoom to please give their comments and ask questions. And please turn on your video before you ask your question. Alternatively, you can also write your question in the chat, but we hope to wrap up soon.
Maybe I can begin. Thank you to both the speakers for their presentation and everybody else who has spoken. And I think this has been a very enriching dialogue. And maybe I can just, since we are ending, ask them how they, what they see going forward in the future, how the trajectory of world history will shape. And this has been mentioned already, but one of the reasons that we wanted to do this dialogue is to say that this is exactly the time when we need to have unity within Asia, or earlier Afro-Asian unity, and whether they could speak about the importance of these relationships within Asia and between Asia and Africa for the future, since I believe, and it has come out from the presentations, that we are perhaps at the end of an epoch when the West is under decline, and something new will have to begin.
Anybody else on the Zoom?
I think this question is attached to Raju's comment, but I am in Philadelphia as well. I'm a student of Dr. Anthony Montero, but my parents are Chinese, and I'm very proud to say that I am a descendant of Chinese civilization, and I appreciated this dialogue very much. it doesn't have to go in depth now, but I think there's also a question of young people and the youth. And how are we going to better prepare the youth of America, China, India, but also the world to be able to see the world situation in the way that we are talking about? And I think I just want to say thank you so much to both the speakers. I learned so much also of the lessons that were spoken about, the distinctions of the state and the people and what democracy means in substance. I think it can be applied to America very well. And I feel very inspired. But I just wanted to add in the question of how to prepare the youth for this emerging epoch.
Oh, Jahan, go ahead.
Yeah, may I just also add to that question? I think returning also to the theme of this event about a dialogue on the concept of democracy, I think it's been established an important point that we must move away from this Cold War anti-communist concept of democracy versus authoritarianism and work towards a concept that's more representative of the aspirations of most of the world's population. So that being said, and also given that we have established that both India and China are coming out of struggles against colonial domination and are, again, part of this world's majority, which we can call the third world. And also that we're coming out of about 20 years of constant regime change wars in which many states have been destroyed by the West. My question is, how do we factor the role of this, we could call Western domination, or the term I prefer, imperialism, in establishing a concept of democracy? Because I think that's something that's missing. We tend to go through the European or the Western idea of democracy, in which this fact of dealing with the reality of imperialism is missing. So I would just like to put that on the table.
Thank you. And I would like to ask our panelists to respond.
From a Chinese point of view, in many ways, we use the term anti-hegemony or anti-hegemonism, mainly refer to the US hegemony in the international order. And so this is, in many ways, it's a struggle of anti-imperialism. And as China is a socialist country, and we read Lenin, his famous work, High Stage of Capitalism is Imperialism. So the Chinese are not naive. We are very clear that if China is weak, the United States will bully us. So China built up its indeed very powerful defense capability in order to say no to the United States. I will remind the fact to the United States, to my American friends or whatever, who have discussions on the US-China relations. I said, remember, during the Cold War, Russia or the Soviet Union and the United States did not fight directly. But in Asia, China and the United States fought twice directly on the battlefields, Korea and Vietnam. I also tell them, you know who was the loser. Because you have to tell imperialists, you cannot bully others. We will fight back. Yeah. But the threshold for using force among all the major powers for China is much higher than other major powers. And because we think this defense capability is indeed for defense. I said the Cold War philosophy is a mutually assured destruction, MAD. Why we should have that? We should have a mutually assured prosperity. We had every reason to do that. But then the United States, given its huge military industrial complex at home, the US has been hijacked, the system has been hijacked by this complex. That's a problem. The other day, I gave a figure. I said China eradicated its last 100 million people out of poverty in the year 2020. China completed this grand mission fighting poverty. We spent roughly 1/10 of the American spending on the Afghan war. We eliminated poverty. Yeah. So with socialism, you can do much, much better. I said with $2.3 trillion you spend on war of Afghanistan, the international community can really eradicate extreme poverty in the world, including poverty in the United States. But US refused to do that. They prefer to throw the money out for the military industry. That's a problem. Yeah.
Ambassador?
Well, I have really, I have had my say. I really let it go. The point is, what Mr. Martin Gates said is very important here. That if we look at this as in terms of this kind of paradigm of just imperialism alone, it may not be sufficient because we are really entering an age of instability, of chaos. That is what when I was speaking about Ukraine, what I had in mind is that I find a lot of writings, for example, about a brave new world waiting to be born. I don't have that degree of optimism. I think we are not quite realizing how dangerous, in fact, these gathering storms, that you can see how dangerous it is going to be in a very short period of time, and it's like the center, like Yeats said, the center cannot hold anymore. That is a kind of situation that is developing. So, this theoretically, all these things are there of, imperialism as the highest level of capitalism and all that. But as a practitioner of politics, at the international level, and being in the diplomatic arena for something like half my lifetime, I can say that I never expected that things would snowball to such a huge crisis, as it is developing. And I can only say this, that we must realize this. Everything else is going to be secondary importance.
Thank you so much to both the speakers and to everybody who came, to our discussants, to the people who are watching via YouTube live stream. Thank you so much for joining us. And this is the start of many very important and timely conversations, especially about the way forward and the future of these relationships in these very perilous times. So with that, I would like to end. Maybe Archishman, you can end the live stream.